Welcome to the No Limits Life podcast, the show where struggle meets strength and every story becomes a blueprint for transformation. I'm Nordine Zouareg, two-time Mr. Universe best-selling author and high-performance coach. And with me, my phenomenal host, Ken.
I could coach you if you wanted to. How you doing?
Good. Greatness doesn't come from avoiding hardship. It comes from answering it with purpose, perseverance, and the courage to serve. This isn't just another conversation. This is where adversity becomes fuel, resilience becomes power, and greatness isn't a gift. It's a decision you make, moment by moment. Let's go beyond the limits and build a life of impact, purpose, and unstoppable growth. Today's guest embodies that truth more than most. Dr. Richard Carmona is a man whose life is a living testament to what's possible when grit, purpose, and service meet. From dropping out of high school to becoming a U.S. Army combat-decorated Special Forces soldier, from serving as a SWAT team leader and highly decorated police officer to becoming a trauma surgeon, EMS director, and university distinguished laureate professor, Dr. Carmona's path defies limitation. And if that wasn't enough, he served as the 17th Surgeon General of the United States, where he led national efforts in disease prevention, health promotion, and disaster preparedness. Born to poor Hispanic immigrant parents and raised in the South Bronx, his story is not just about personal transformation. It's about national impact. Dr. Carmona, it's an honor to have you with us.
Thanks. I'm happy to be with you.
I'd like to begin with that quote again and read it. Greatness doesn't come from avoiding hardship. It comes from answering it with purpose, perseverance, and the courage to serve. Does this resonate with your own life journey and the challenges you've chosen to face rather than avoid?
Well, it resonates a great deal with me because of, I would say, my mother inspired me throughout my life, through tough times, through times when we were homeless, times we didn't have enough food. My mother taught me how to be a better parent as well, because through all the adversity, her whole goal in life was her children, and she gave up everything so her children could eat and have a place to be. And so as I became older, I didn't realize what an impact she had had on my life. She educated me. She would go to the library, and she would bring home books. And my two younger brothers and my sister would go, "Oh my gosh, Mom's bringing home books, we're in trouble." She'd make us sit at the dinner table with roaches running across the table, mice on the floor, often no heat in the house, wearing clothes, winter clothes in the house, but she'd sit and talk to us. And my mother was self-educated. She didn't finish high school, but she was a voracious reader. She spoke 5 languages. She knew more about geopolitics than any elected official, which I know that bar's pretty low, but nevertheless. But she would always quiz me. She'd say, she'd ask me about democracy. She'd ask me about communism. She'd ask me about people. I'd say, "Mom, why do I need to know that?" And she said, "Richard, you are my leader. You are in charge of your brothers and sister when I'm not here," because she worked nights. And she said, "You need to learn about the world because it's the world you're going to go into." And she prepared me for everything I encountered in my life, and never looking at it as adversity, but looking at its opportunity each time. So I would give her credit for never giving up on me, even though I failed her a lot as a kid.
Your mom, your hero.
Yes, she is.
You grew up then listening to your story without a father?
My father was there. My father was a nice man, but he often was absent. He was, he was a street guy. He had a job, but when I think of how I raised my children, and I mean every day, even my children, the boys, I'll give them a hug when I see them and give them a kiss, tell them I love them. And my father, he had a very difficult time in that community, but yet I knew he cared for me, but he was absent a lot and wasn't there to provide the fatherly guidance that you would expect.
Parenting is not the one size fits all.
Right.
I hear that a lot. And interestingly enough, you mentioned your mom. We had so many guests prior here that came to the studio and said their mom was their number one inspirational figure in their lives.
Yeah.
You mentioned homelessness and growing up poor. Can you elaborate a little bit more? Because a lot of our listeners are fascinated by people who, like yourself, who achieve a certain level of success that's started from nothing.
I was born in Harlem, and we moved to Queens, and that's a very distant memory. I was maybe 4 or 5 years old. In my first grade, we walked to school in Astoria, Queens. We're living in subsidized housing. Mm-hmm. And I remember one day coming home from school. I was 5 or 6. And I remember looking, there was a truck out in front of the building, and on top of a pile of all of this stuff in the back of this truck was my bicycle that my uncle had given me. And I said, I remember I was perplexed. Why is my bicycle
That's
on that
not a good
truck?
sign when you see your bike on the truck.
And my mother, then I was walking up to the apartment, and my mother grabbed me and she says, we have to go. I said, what's the matter? She said, we can't live here anymore. It was a truck from the Salvation Army that picked up all our stuff because we were thrown out.
This is in Queens?
Yeah, Astoria, Queens.
Wow. So you're how old again?
Maybe 5, 6. I was in first grade, I think.
So what little Richard is thinking then?
I just remember I was very confused, but I always trusted my mother. My father wasn't there, and so we didn't have a place to go. We stayed with some friends that we knew, and then I went to stay with my grandmother in an apartment in the projects in the Bronx. Mm-hmm. And there was a tiny little apartment, and all the kids, there was 4 of us, all slept on a pull-out couch. Yeah, 4 kids in the living room.
It's like Willy Wonka, the way they slept.
And then my grandmother and my aunt slept in the back room. Mm-hmm. And so we stayed there for months. And my father wasn't around. I don't know what happened. I don't know if he was in trouble, but I don't remember him being there. And my mother was there sometimes, and then she would stay with friends or family. Mm-hmm. And eventually we got ourselves together, and that's when we moved.
How many siblings you had?
I have 2 brothers and a sister.
Back then, how many were you living in that environment? There
was my 2 younger brothers and my sister, who was newborn. She was less than a year old.
Wow. We used to share an apartment with my parents and 7 kids. Me and my 6 siblings sleeping in the same bed. My parents were sleeping on the floor. So, but for me, it was fun.
I would say we got, it's just, I didn't know anything else. Like people will say to me, oh, you grew up really poor. Yeah. I said, I never realized I was poor until I got older, because everybody on the block, that's where they lived.
Would you think that poor is a state of mind?
Well, it's a physical state as well, but I think if you're in the environment that every kid that you hang around with is struggling, every parent is trying to make payment to the rent,
What I'm trying to say is that you can still be rich in your heart.
Oh, no question. Yes, I think that's So we were happy kids. We played stickball.
That's what I'm getting to.
I learned to swim in the Harlem River, which is why I became so healthy, because I was exposed to every pathogen known to mankind.
Oh
but
my God.
But we were just happy kids, But then we couldn't live there anymore because there was not. So we went to my grandmother's, and then from my grandmother's we stayed a couple of places, and then I remember there was a point where. I was supposed to go someplace, and I didn't want to live there. And I ran away from home. I was 6 or 7. And I remember I got my bike, and I rode across the Triborough Bridge, and I went back to Astoria, where we used to live.
Is that Queens?
Queens, yeah, okay. Right under the Triborough Bridge.
Okay.
And I said, and that was my safe place, I think. When I think back, the psychology behind it. And I went over to one of the neighbors' houses, who I knew them very well, and they were immigrants from Colombia. And they recognized me and said, why are you here? I said, well, I want to stay with you. And then, we didn't have a phone, so they couldn't call.
Oh, wow.
And there was no cell phones. So they had a car, and they drove to Harlem and brought me back home to my mother, who was, distraught because she couldn't find me. And everything got settled. But I remember that time, and I remember I was a little kid, and I had to drive. There was a walkway across the Triborough Bridge that goes from Manhattan at 125th Street in Harlem into Astoria. And I had to carry the bike up these steps. And then I just rode the bike across the other side, and just I knew the neighborhood. I knew how to get to where they lived.
It's so interesting to hear from you that safe place. Yeah, we all have a safe place when we grow up. Yeah, that's the place we want to go. I used to go to my uncle when my father was a little abusive to my mom and us. I would just run away, just like you, and I would go to my uncle because it was safer. The environment, I felt safe. And that's when I started thinking about what little Nordine was going to do with his life. That's why I asked you, what was happening with little Richard when he went to that safe place? Was little Richard already looking ahead?
No, I really wasn't. I mean, I was living day to day. I didn't know what the next day would bring. When I look at some of my report cards from grammar school that I still have, that I was very difficult. I didn't learn well. I didn't pay attention. But I attribute it not that I didn't have the potential to learn, but I was in an unstable environment.
Are you trying to tell us that you had poor grades?
Oh, I failed. I dropped out of high school. I failed repeatedly.
Where were you in high school then? What city were you
I
living
was in New York City, and it was at a time when they were taking kids from the hood and busing them to nice areas because they wanted to get integration.
Right.
So I was in Harlem, and they give you a train pass or a bus pass, and I have to take the subway to the Bronx and then take a bus across to the DeWitt Clinton High School, which is
every day. You do this back and forth
every day. Well, but often you don't end up there because if you give a kid a bus pass and a train pass, there are other things you can do as well. So I was a truant. I didn't go to school a lot. And I was smart enough to realize
I have hope for my son.
Well, because we didn't have a phone, they couldn't call my parents, and I knew how to get the key to the mailbox before the mailman came.
So did you finally graduate from high school, or did you get a GED?
When was the
or what?
point?
No, at about 16 or 17, I had menial jobs. I was an ocean lifeguard for the city of New York. I worked in the mail room. I did a bunch of things, and I was kind of going to school, but not really. And then I met an officer, an Army officer in Special Forces, who I got to talking to one day at a candy store. And he said to me, what do you do? And I kind of, as we would say back then, shucking and jiving. He said, well, you go to school. I said, well, yeah. He says, let me tell you something. So for several days I met him, and when I first saw him, I saw him in his uniform, which was the thing that impressed me. He was in Special Forces and had all the
But how old
stuff.
were you then?
When I first met him, I was just turned 17.
Okay.
And we had a conversation, and he said to me, what are your plans? And he was kind of the same things my mother tried to impress upon me, but now this is a man I didn't know who had a uniform on and was in the military. And he said to me, so what do you do? And I said, well, and he said, you don't go to school, do you? I said, yeah, I do. And he said to me, so what are your plans? And kind of the questions we've been talking about, and I didn't really have any. It's just day to day. Where am I going to eat? Because often we didn't have food. My brothers and I would go out and collect soda bottles, and when we got to about $1, we'd turn it in, and we'd buy a quarter pound of American cheese, a Campbell's soup, a loaf of bread, and a container of milk was like 90 cents back then. Okay?
Wow.
And then if we had the extra 10 cents, we would buy a pastry, a streusel loaf, and divide it in 4, so each of us had a little dessert. And so that was life, and sometimes we have food, sometimes we didn't. Sometimes the rent wasn't paid, et cetera. But this guy kind of gave me my reality check. He just said, here's the deal, Richard. If you stay here, you're not going to do well. And he said, and he named a guy in the neighborhood. I said, yeah, Danny's still here. He said, is he down in the park on the bench in the corner? I said, yeah. He says, he's still dealing drugs there. I said, how'd you know? He said, because he was doing that when I was here. And I said, really? And he said, so here's the deal. If you don't get out of here, the best you can hope for is that you'll own that bench when somebody kills him.
You have a visual right there.
And then he gave me a card. And he said,
were you scared then?
I wasn't scared. I wasn't. I think why I stayed engaged was I was very impressed with this man. And then he gave me a card. He said, go see this guy.
Was he an Army recruiter, or he just...
No, he was home on leave.
Oh, okay.
He was home on leave and had been in the neighborhood. But he gave me a card, and he said, go see this guy. And it was an Army recruiter on Fordham Road in Grand Concourse. The recruiting booth is still there, 50-something years later.
Wow.
And I went up there, and I talked to the recruiter.
So let's go back a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I want to know.
Yeah.
It's intriguing. You said, I was impressed by this gentleman. You were impressed by him or what the threat he gave you?
I would say more his demeanor, the uniform, the professional presence, how he conducted himself.
You like that?
He was articulate, and I was like, well, this guy's squared away, So we got in this conversation that lasted over several days. When I bump into him and we talk, he was in civilian clothes then, and then he just said, here's the card, go talk to this guy. I went up there and I spoke to the Army recruiter, and I remember it was a big, imposing guy, African-American guy. And he says, come on in here, son, sit down. He's talking to me, and then he gives me some tests, and he says, come back in a couple of days. And I come back, and I talk to him, and he says, you're a whole lot brighter than I thought. He says, you've done really well on these tests. And he said, do you want to join the Army? I said, well, I think so, because I don't really have anything else to do. I'm working these jobs, but probably it'd be good for me to get away. And I remember he had a paper like this.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I want you to sign this paper. And he says, we're going to make you all you can be.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
And he said, now, how old are you? I said, I'm 17. He said, well, you can't sign. You have to take it to your mother or your father. So I took it to Mom. And Mom said, I'm not going to sign that. And she says, why? She says, because all the kids like you that are Hispanic, black, poor kids, they're sending you to Vietnam and you're going to die.
Yeah.
So she wouldn't sign.
I don't blame her.
She wouldn't sign.
I don't think I would sign
So
for
what
my boys
happened
either.
then?
So I said, I'm going to go. I did all the paperwork, but I couldn't leave till my 18th birthday. But by then I had multiple conversations with my mother. I said, Mom, I just got to do this, and it still breaks my heart when I think about it because she was worried she was going to lose her son.
Sure.
Absolutely, yeah.
But, she supported me and I went. And,
You must have been towards the tail end of Vietnam.
No, I was right in the middle.
Really?
I went to Vietnam in '69. I went in the Army end of '67, beginning of '68.
Oh,
Special
wow.
Forces training is a year, a little over a year. So
So you go through normal training and then special forces, right?
yeah, basic training, advanced training. So all of us who didn't have education, because I went in as a high school dropout, you are trained to be a combatant, what they call infantry. Okay.
So you're were you special forces infantry then?
No, there's no such thing as that. No,
What is-
basically, you have to get into the service first in any MOS, military
Okay.
occupational specialty.
Okay.
I went to what used to call 11 Bravo, which is a light weapons infantryman. These are the kids that go and fight. These are the kids you saw dying.
So your mom was right.
Yeah,
That's what
so-
you're going to do.
Yes. So then I went to advanced training, which is advanced infantry skills. Then I volunteered for jump school to be a paratrooper.
Oh.
And then at Fort Benning, because I went in with the intention of going to Special Forces, but the recruiter told me we can't guarantee that to you. What we can guarantee you is the opportunity to try out for Special Forces, but you have to go through all of this first and go to jump school, become a paratrooper, and at that point, we'll give you a chance. So when I finished jump school at Fort Benning, the recruiters there from Special Forces, and they're talking to me, and they said, well, kid, your GT score, which is the military intelligence score, which is kind of an oxymoron, I know, military intelligence, but he says, you scored real well. You can go to officer training school, or you can be a helicopter pilot or Special Forces. So I said, no, I want to go to Special Forces. He says, no, you should go be an officer. I said, no, I want to go to Special Forces. So they were kind of perplexed. And I went to Special Forces, but then I did there's a bunch of testing you have to go through to get in. And then as I'm in training, I get called in one day and said, but you're a high school dropout. I said, yes, Sergeant, I am. He said, well, you got to be a high school graduate to be in Special Forces.
Oh, man.
And they said, so you don't qualify. And I said, well, what do I have to do? He says, you need to get a GED. I said, how do I do that? He says, well, you have to take a course. What course? He said, well, the Army offers it, but you're in training now. I said, can I take a test? He said, well, you don't want to take the test. You have to take the training first.
Right.
I said, let me take the test. He was a little dubious if I would pass.
Yeah.
So I took it and I passed. And I got a GED. I have a GED. I have my Army GED.
But how were you gaining all your knowledge if you weren't going to school? Were you reading?
My mother was a voracious reader. I told you in the beginning.
Right.
She would talk to me about politics, about science, about mythology, she was my teacher.
Your teacher.
And what I didn't realize was years later she was preparing me for the world.
Right.
And I didn't understand that, and I was just, here's Mom again telling me
amazing.
To read this thing or that thing or read. She would say she owned almost nothing herself, and she had a little purse and she'd hold up this card, and she said, besides my children, this is the most important thing I own. It was her library card, because she said it connects me to the world.
Oh.
All of her free time she
Wealth.
spent in the library, okay? And then she talked to me in Spanish or Portuguese or French. I go, Mom, I don't understand. She says, precisely, you need to learn other languages and cultures, because the world is made up of people from all over those
So have
places. Yes, I speak Spanish, and I can understand a little bit.
Français? No.
No français. No parlez-vous français. No. But my mother's message was always to stay curious. Keep learning throughout your life.
Okay,
That's so amazing.
And so she talked to me in another language, and when I couldn't answer or understand, say, so now you need to learn this, okay? Because you're a very small part of a bigger world.
Yeah.
So it's all of those things that really inspired me.
So those barriers that you faced in your life, and overcame them.
Yeah.
Your mom obviously was part of it. She was always there.
Yes.
In your head and in your heart.
Yes.
pushing you to the next level. Can you give us an example of a challenge you went through and that's what happened when you needed her, to push you?
I can tell you many challenges throughout my life that I always thought, and I'll tell you some back then, and I'll tell you some even when I was Surgeon General.
Mm-hmm.
So back then, there were street gangs. There was a group called the Social Lords who kind of ran it. There were people running numbers. There were drug dealers. I mean, the building I lived in, you'd get up in the morning to go to school, most likely there's somebody strung out on the steps, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And there's dealers there. And the older kids who are making the money and dealing, they know you. So people would say, did you think it was safe? No, nobody bothered us. We didn't have anything there, But it's the environment you grew up in. And so Mom would always, tell me about honesty and stuff. And, these kids you'd hear the stories, they were robbing places and, just, as they say, getting over, trying to just live.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
But she always impressed upon me. And I would have a lot of conversations with her. She said, don't give in to temptation because you see something easy that these guys are doing. Yeah. You'll get in trouble. So Mom was always that guiding light.
The guiding light. Yes.
And I can give you 100 examples of that. And even when I became Surgeon General, and I would be in the White House dealing with Congress and being torn by politics and what was right for the people, okay? Because my job description as Surgeon General is to protect, promote, and advance the health, safety, and security of the United States. So that's not a political thing. But in Washington, everything is political. So you're getting pulled in left and right. But every time I'd have to make a decision, I often thought, what would Mom say to me right now based on what I'm going to do? Would she tell me that's the wrong thing?
Was she alive to see you do this?
No. She died before I was Surgeon General, but she saw me get through she saw me in medical school. I tried to move her out, but she wouldn't leave New York. But I can remember many times sitting there and thinking, well, these guys want this, these people want that. The bigger picture here is I am the doctor of the nation. Whether it's a health or safety or security issue, what's the best thing? And you have two parties arguing over what the best thing is. But really, when you get rid of the politics, there's usually a clear path forward, which is about what your fiduciary responsibility is to the people of the United States. Mm-hmm. That's it. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's not Republican or Democrat. Mm-hmm. That's what's the right thing to do here for the people. Yeah. So I always would joke, Mom's talking to me.
Yeah,
she's telling me.
She was removing those barriers.
Yes, no, it is, and I can even to this day. Yeah. There are things what I will think that, and she gave me a way of thinking of things and never forgetting that in public service, it's never about you. In leadership, it's never about you. It's always about you having the privilege to serve others, and don't ever breach that privilege.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. You walked through fire in many roles, from combat zones to operating rooms to the political arena, as you mentioned. What has hardship taught you about true success, and what sacrifices does leadership demand?
Well, true success is really based on your mission. And again, my mom never used those terms, but she always talked about having a vision, and an understanding of what you're trying to accomplish. Certainly in the military, I was able to refine those thoughts that even when I came out and I started college, homework wasn't a task, it was a mission. And everything got filtered through how much time is this going to take, what resources do I need to complete this mission, what are the deliverables, and who am I responsible to with these deliverables? Taking control
of your environment.
That's it.
Yes.
So everything. And the joke now with my kids when I raised them, I tell you a funny story. My oldest daughter, she had friends over the house. She was a teenager then. And the kids knew my background, both, law enforcement, special forces and stuff. And one of the young girls, friends of hers, says, "You think I could talk to your dad? I'd like to get some, advice as far as my future and things." She says, "Don't talk to my dad." And I said, "Well, why not?" If you talk to him, the first thing he's going to ask you is, what is your mission? Okay? And he's going to ask you, how do you figure you're going to get there? And so she comes over and talks to me later. And I said, okay, so what is your mission in life? And what resources do you have to get there? What's your timeline? Who's the team you're going to pull together to help you get there? And my daughter's over there rolling her eyes.
It's like, that's what I told you.
So many years later, my daughter has my grandson. And she's admonishing him about something. Good kid, really good kid. And I'm listening to the conversation. I guess he didn't do his homework and didn't do this. And she looks at him and says, "What was your mission?" And I look at her and she says, "Don't you say anything." But I gave him I think one of the best things you can do as a father or mother, or even as a leader in combat, is you give your subordinates, your team, a way to think through critical issues and how to arrive at a reasonable solution for a complex issue. No matter how simple or complex it is, it's the same approach. And even to this day, when I sit on big corporate boards now and I do things at a global level, when I'm being tasked, I'm always thinking the same, what is it they want me to do? What's the impact going to be? How do I accomplish that? What resources do I need? Where's my team? What are my deliverables? It's the same approach.
Yes, creating that environment.
Yeah, well, whether you're a young soldier or whether you're the CEO of a company.
Absolutely.
It's the same approach.
So I have a mission question for you. Okay. So pretend you're Surgeon General right now.
Yeah.
So because I know you're serving the public, what would you say that your number one health concern is for the public now?
I would say that probably the number one challenge for us as a nation is to how to come together again as a United States of America, retain our reputation globally. We're creating doubt in the minds of the public as to who they can trust anymore. And so what do? They revert to their tribes who are dealing in mis and disinformation. We have people in leadership positions that are casting doubt. People don't know what to do, so they go to politicians to get input on science. That's absurd. Go to your doctor, okay? Because they don't have a vested interest except keeping you healthy.
Right.
And so I think a divided nation may be the greatest plague that we are suffering from today. Misinformation, disinformation, people who are scared, they don't know who to turn to, and leadership that is failing us. This is not a partisan issue. This is about the expectation of superior leadership to retain our global presence, which the rest of the world depends on. So there are big, big issues here that I am worried about every day. And to me, it has nothing to do with Republicans or Democrats. It has to do with getting the right leaders in those positions and have them understanding that job should be based solely on the privilege for you to serve selflessly, to deliver the best information so that informed citizens can make the best decisions. We don't have that now because there's a struggle for power.
Right.
That's not leadership. And the leadership I learned from my mom and what I learned in special forces, what I learned in combat, what I learned as a police officer, nobody ever asked on your special forces team or on my SWAT team that I ran here for many years, are you a Republican or Democrat? Quite frankly, I didn't give a shit what party they belonged to or if they did have a party.
Right.
What I knew was they earned the right to be in the tunnel with me to take on whatever that challenge was. And we're not seeing that from our government today.
Yeah.
I can feel a lot of passion, and we can go on and on and on talking about the real needs of the country, and thank you for sharing that. I wanted to ask you one more question. What would you say to the next generation, those trying to find meaning and strength in a world full of noise and pressure?
Have a game plan for your life. Understand a world full...
Have a mission.
Have a mission. Thank you. Have a mission. Understand that the world is full of distractions, that if you get into a trajectory that is involved with all of these distractions, it will not result in anything that is beneficial to you or those you have the privilege to serve. So you have to be able to, see the trees in the forest as it goes and understand, why am I here and what is it I'm trying to do? And for me, that's never been a partisan issue. So when I speak to young people, I always say, this is not about politics. It's about you as a young man or woman, and what will you contribute with your education to your community, to the nation, to the world as you move forward, okay? Stay focused on the mission, and the mission is always something bigger than you. It's about you having the privilege to lead. Leadership is simply defined as being responsible for the destiny of others. And you have to keep that in the forefront.
What's in it for them?
That's it. It's I am going to give up my time to make it better for everybody. It's not me, but everybody that's in a leadership position. And I know what all the admirals, generals I work with. Some of them are in political parties. But when you put on the uniform of the nation and you're executing unlawful orders, nobody cares about your party. It's about what you need to do to make our nation safe.
Right.
Period. Okay.
Right. So as I said, Dr. Carmona, you are very passionate, and I want to thank you for everything you've done.
It's me that should be thanking
for a
lot of people.
For the people, for the world. And to our listeners, hardship doesn't knock to destroy you. It arrives to reveal you. The path to greatness is not paved with ease, but with moments that test your will, shape your values, and call forth for deeper why. It's not about having a perfect plan. It's about rising when everything in you says stay down. Greatness isn't measured by applause or titles. It's found in the quiet resilience of someone who shows up again and again, fueled by a purpose bigger than comfort. When you face adversity with intention instead of avoidance, it transforms. What once felt like a burden becomes the very reason you grow wings. And when you climb, is not just for you, but for those who need your light. You've stepped into legacy. Don't wait for conditions to be ideal. Step into the challenge with heart and let your service become your strength. What hardship are you facing today, and how can you use it as a stepping stone towards something greater than yourself? Thank you for joining us, and a special thank to my team, Ken and Emilio, and to Dr. Carmona for this amazing episode. Until next time, live your no limits life.
We want to make sure we thank
nice.
Our viewers and our listeners. Please like, share, subscribe if you enjoyed listening to Dr. Carmona today as much as I did. And remember, keep believing, keep creating, and keep living your no limits life.